When I was 23 years old, I was married. It's when Courtney and I married. And I had visions of grandeur. We had just rented an apartment across from a church building. It was a 3-bedroom apartment. And I was so excited to have that apartment because I, for the first time in my life, was going to have my own study. I didn't have to have my books in my own room that I slept in. I was in our 3-bedroom apartment. It was just Courtney and myself. I was going to have a study all to myself. I can still see it. And I thought to myself, once I got out of these dorms, into my own place with my own study, I was going to pray and pray and pray. If only I had a place to myself to get away, I was really going to begin to pray more than I had as a Bible college student. Well, do you know what happened? Basically, nothing changed. Because I found out by hard experience, the problem, now I was praying, I knew the Lord, I loved the Lord, but the problem with me increasing prayer was not the location I was in, it was me. And even though I got married, even though I changed houses, even though I had a study on my own, I didn't change. I brought the same me to the study. And basically nothing changed early on there at least. I say all that because that's kind of what Paul is looking at today. My problem was not my location. My problem was, as it's been said, I was not blooming where God had planted me for a season. He had planted me in the dorms at Welch College with a bunch of guys, and that's where I was at. And if I couldn't serve the Lord as I ought to have there, I was not going to serve the Lord when I got my own place. It was me that was the problem. And what Paul is looking at here in verses 17 through 24 is that wherever the Lord has saved us at, wherever He has planted us at, the Lord wants us to bloom there, so to speak. This may seem a little bit strange, maybe. We've been talking about marriage, and next week, God willing, we're going to be looking at singleness. I think that's very important for us to look at, the second half of the chapter. It might seem strange that Paul begins here this section talking about living for the Lord where He's called you at. But here's the point that Paul is making. The point he's making is whether you're married or unmarried, whether you've been married for years or you're single, where you're at when God saves you, generally speaking, is where you need to stay serving the Lord at. That's his point here. So let's just pick up. We'll look at verse 17. Verse 17 gives a general teaching, and then Paul gives us 2 examples here in this chapter of what he means. And I hope to have some good discussion amongst ourselves tonight as well. So here's where let's pick up in verse 16. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? They're not under bondage, he says in verse 15. And then he comes right into verse 17. And here's the general teaching for us tonight. Only as the Lord has assigned, or that word means divided. The way that He has divided you up, the way that He has put you in a certain position of life. He's put you all in different positions. Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each. The calling here in Paul does mean simply salvation. If God has called you, that means He has saved you, is what Paul is looking at here. As God has called each, in this manner, let him walk. So in their context, if you had a married man to a married Christian man to a married unchristian woman, Paul says, look, you became a Christian in this relationship, just stay there. Don't try to get a divorce. Stay where God has put you. You have somebody in Corinth and they're single and they became a Christian while they were single. Paul is saying to them, okay, look, you're single. You now know the Lord. Look, just stay there. Just stay single. Now, he has a lot more to say about that. But that's what Paul's point is here. It sounds strange to our ears. It sounds different to us. But Paul is saying where God saved you at, God saved you for a purpose right where you were at. Stay there and blossom and bring forth fruit and serve the Lord where you are at. Don't try to change. Don't try to run off into a different direction. Wherever God saved you at, stay. That's the general teaching that Paul is giving to the church here. And he gives two examples of this. The first example is about circumcision. And when it's about circumcision, what he means is Jew and Gentile here. Verse 18, was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. So if you're a Gentile at that time, uncircumcised because of religion, he says when you became a Christian as a Gentile, don't run off and try to become a Jew. There's no point in that. It's not, God called you as a Gentile, stay a Gentile. Verse 19, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. That's an amazing statement, by the way, because that's a command in the Old Testament. That's a command. And Paul is saying here, hey, whether you're circumcised or not, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, does not matter at all anymore. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Paul's point is, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, you can obey God where you're at. It's like people who become Christians and they're in an unchristian home. Maybe there's people there who are smoking in the house. Maybe they're cursing in the house. Maybe they're even making fun of the new Christian in the house. And someone may say today, well, I just can't live the Christian life in an environment like that. And Paul would say, basically, if you can't live the Christian life in a house like that, you're probably not a Christian at all. Because God has called that person at that time in their life, at that place, and if we are Christians, our Christianity will show forth even in the most difficult circumstances. Here, Jew and Gentile, he says it doesn't matter. Verse 20, each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. And then he gives the second example, starting in verse 21, is about slavery. Verse 21, were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. Now, it is important for us to see that most people today, when you think of slavery, your mind goes back to American slavery and the horrors of American slavery. Slavery in Rome was just about 100% different than slavery in America. The best doctors of Rome were very often Greek slaves. The lawyers at times were Greek slaves, were slaves in Rome. People sold themselves into slavery on purpose because it was a better life at times. It's just a completely different environment in the first century. Nevertheless, though, what he says here is, were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it, he says. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that. Verse 22, for he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. What he's driving at is what we'll see in verse 24, that the only thing that really matters is being with Jesus. And you and I can be with Jesus under the worst circumstances possible. We can be with Jesus. And we can serve Him. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. He says, okay, you're in slavery in Rome. Fine. Know this, you're the free man of the Lord. When a Roman slave became free, he was known as a freedman. They had a very structured society. They had classes in Rome. And when you were a slave and you became free, you had a class, you had a title in society, you were a freedman. He says, okay, you were converted while you were a slave in the Roman Empire, fine. Just know this, Christ has set you free. You're Christ's free man. Okay, you were converted as a free man. You were not in slavery. Fine. Just know this. You're the slave of Christ, he says. There's no escaping this. You belong to the Lord. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Now here is kind of the summary of this teaching, and then I hope to look at some different things with you. The summary of this teaching again, verse 24, brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. Paul says, you want to know about marriage? You're talking about, should I marry? Should I become single? If my husband's done me wrong, what should I do? Paul says, don't allow your desire for marriage and don't allow your desire for other things choke out the fact that our life is about God. Not about marriage, not about singleness, not about anything else. Our life is about God. Now this, what he says here, plays a part in going back to all their questions on marriage, but it certainly plays a huge part going forward when he gets in to being single and having undistracted devotion to the Lord. This argument's kind of a bridge to both these sections in this chapter. Now Paul is not saying here it's wrong to marry, of course. Look in verse 28. But if you marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. It's obviously not wrong to marry. If you look in verse 35, this I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you. He's not saying it's wrong to marry if you're single when you're a Christian. What he's saying here is this: our main focus must be the Lord, whether we're married or not married. Our main focus must be Him, and the place in life we were at when we were converted, generally speaking, stay there. Or at least consider staying there. Now that sounds strange, doesn't it? Come from a man who was converted in Kentucky as a single man, and now I live in Georgia with a wife and 3 kids. And of course the Lord calls us, the Lord leads us in all this in life. But this general teaching of remaining with Christ, where He has called you, is what Paul is looking at here. Bloom where you're planted is what he's saying. Now before we get into some different things tonight about these verses, does anybody have any discussion or question on this brief exposition of these verses we've had so far tonight? I think what Paul is saying here, first, this chapter doesn't deal with this. The overall picture of the Bible is most people get married. Marriage is a good thing. It's not, so we don't even have to think about marriage as a sinful thing or anything like that. But what Paul is saying here is for everyone. Down in verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. He's just talking in generalities. Let's say if you had a Christian who's been a Christian for some years, he's been married for some years, and his wife dies. Well, Paul would say basically here, if you marry in the Lord, of course you don't do anything wrong. That's good. Go ahead and do that. But he would say, think very carefully before you do that. Because the Lord has brought you to this position. And the Lord may use you in a great way as a single man here. So his advice is for all ages here. I will highlight something though in verse 26. I think then that this is good in view of the present distress. That could be looking at something that's happening in their culture. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. But when you think about singleness and persecution, well, I would imagine it's a lot easier to be persecuted knowing you don't have a wife and kids at home depending on you. So that's something that Paul's looking at here probably. It's a lot easier to serve Christ when your life is on the line, when you don't have to worry about who's going to take care of your family when you're dead. But I think this is general counsel for every person in every age of life is what I take this as. Yeah, I think One thing is, of course, to talk to your parents about whether to marry or not to marry is a big thing. Parental authority in the life of people. But of course, again, the Bible would teach it's not good for man to be alone. For most people, it's a good thing to be married. But I think, at least in my position, looking over these verses, it really kind of comes at you like this, doesn't it? Because I've never thought this way hardly. I've never thought about, consider the position I was in when I was converted, and the general truth that God would like for you to stay like that. I've never considered that before. And I'd say a lot of people... So it does hit us. As modern men, it hits us differently, doesn't it? Because we don't think like this. But yeah, I mean, marriage is good. And if we look down in verse 36, but if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let her or them marry. So, I mean, marriage is wonderful. It's good. Paul believes, if you look down in verse 39 and 40, a wife is bound as long as her husband lives. If her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is. And he says in another place that he's just trying to spare you pain. There's going to be a lot of pain. There's a lot of blessing in marriage. There's also a lot of pain, especially if this is maybe in times of persecution or upcoming persecution. And so yeah, I mean, I don't know if that helps very much. So Paul is very much here. He's the sovereignty of God. God's work in our life. When He calls us, where were we at when He called us? Where is all this at? Paul says, at the very least, and this is even saying it less than what the words actually say. But Paul is saying, hey, consider very carefully where you were at when you were saved, and if God wants you to remain like that. Anybody else? So there's a question there in verse 38 of whether Paul is talking about a father with a virgin daughter, or he's talking about a man who's contemplating on whether to get married. There's a question there. Like my Bible says daughter, but it's in italics, and that means it's not in the Bible actually. It just says virgin is what it says. So it's kind of up to interpretation. Is this a virgin daughter of a father, or is this a virgin that a man is thinking about marrying? So it's a little bit ambiguous to some degree, and we'll try to look more at that next week probably. Paul is speaking here. Marriage is a very honorable thing. It's a good thing, and yet Paul says, at least in some sense, the person who does not get married is doing better. They can spend more of their time with the Lord, I think is what they would say, or what he would say. He talks about later on in this chapter, undistracted devotion to God. He says when you get married, you know what? You got to worry about pleasing your wife and pleasing your husband. Those are good godly things. But that does at times take you away from going to somebody's house and witnessing to them. So in that context, I would take it as Paul says, hey, you do even better if you don't get married, is what he's saying. That is not to make being single like a special category above marriage, because being single is a gift of God that God gives us. It's a gifting. It's not in Matthew 19. In Matthew 19, this is after Jesus has spoken. Spoken is probably too lightly a way of putting it. Jesus has interacted with some of the religious leaders. about marriage and about God's intent and how man is not to divorce. Whatever God brings together, man is not to separate. And yet Jesus does give exceptions. But then verse 10, 11, and 12, the disciples asked Jesus about this teaching in private. The disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. So this gift of singleness is a gift of God that God gives some people. So Paul, I won't read verse 12, so Paul clearly in 1 Corinthians 7 says in some way, you do better not to marry. You have more time for the Lord. And yet most people will marry, and God is pleased with that, and that's God's will for most people. So when you look at this chapter, we've got to look at the whole biblical picture. If we only look at this chapter, myself and all of us could wrongly take Paul out of context, take the Bible out of context. So I hope that helps some. Anybody else? So after he was married, his wife dies, and he felt, I won't put words in your mouth, but he felt the Lord didn't want him to marry again. Yeah, so that's very good. This goes back to this teaching here. This is different. This is different. And yet Paul says to at least, I shouldn't say Paul says it more strongly than this, but we should at least be open and consider, hey, where am I at in life right now? Where has God's providence led me? Maybe He wants me to bloom right here and stay right here. I thought of this a second ago to your question. Paul in 1 Timothy in a different context says, I want the younger widows to marry. He says that in a different context as well. So that as well would play into our understanding of what Paul says here. Anybody else? Let's talk about this general teaching of serving Christ where we are at. That's essentially what Paul is saying here. He's saying wherever you are at right now as a Christian, don't look over the wall and see what God has next for you 20 years from now maybe. Wherever you're at right now, bloom there. Serve Him right now in this life just the way you are. And sure, maybe God will give you a desire to marry. Maybe God will give you a desire to move somewhere else. And this is wide-ranging in its application. Sure, be open to that. Again, I'm in Georgia. I wasn't born in Georgia. I'm married. I wasn't born married. The Lord calls us. The Lord leads us in all this. At the same time, this is something for us to consider very seriously tonight. Why does God call us to stay where we're at when He saves us? One is for purpose. And that was already mentioned. This man felt like he had a purpose. I'll give you an example of this principle is William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce. He's 21 years old. He's single. He's rich. He's ungodly. He's just living life any way he wants to. He's a wealthy man overseas. A couple years after that, he becomes a Christian. And he's already in politics. And he starts to think, you know what? I'm a Christian and I'm in politics. Can a Christian really be in politics? So he goes to John Newton, who wrote, and this was not planned. We sang Amazing Grace earlier tonight. Which is written by John Newton, the former slave trader, John Newton. William Wilberforce, this wealthy politician who is now a Christian, goes to John Newton and says, you know what, can I really be a Christian and a politician? And I think maybe even, he says, maybe I should go into the ministry. And John Newton says, no, you serve God where you're at right now in politics. And William Wilberforce, a Christian man, serves the Lord. He's standing for the abolition of slavery. He wants it stopped. He wants it done away with in Europe. 1807 would come. The slave trade is done away with, in part because of what he's doing in politics. And then in 1833, 3 days before he dies, they either have the votes or it's actually taken to do away with slavery completely. That was one man staying where he was at when God saved him. And God used him in a mighty way. So this principle is wide-ranging. It's not just for marriage. It's not just for singleness. It's for all of our life. On the flip side of that, I've mentioned Dr. Mark Lloyd-Jones so much. A famed physician as a young man on his way to stardom. He's 25, 26. He accepts the call to preach, leaves that behind and goes to a poorer community in Wales and preaches. So God has a plan for all of us. But we ought to consider, wherever we're at when we become a Christian, consider maybe that's where God wants me to stay at. That's what William Wilberforce did. And God used him tremendously. A big principle here is what the Bible's teaching us is be content. Be content where we're at. Turn to Philippians 4. Philippians chapter 4. Listen to what Paul says starting in verse 10. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want. Now listen to this. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned. Even the apostle had to learn. He's just a man like we are. For I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret. Everybody wants to know the secret, don't they? Paul says, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. He has learned, he's starving, but he's okay. He's filled, but he's okay. What is the secret? I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. And I'll stop there. And if you notice in 1 Corinthians 7, in verse 24, brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. So what we're looking at here is to serve Christ where we have been called is to be content with where we are at in life. Now Paul goes on and says, but you've done well to give to me, he says to the Philippians. You've done well to support me. It's not wrong to be supported. It's good. Paul thanks them. But Paul says at the same time, even when I had nothing, basically, I was okay because I had Christ. And that's really the message from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Don't think you're going to find contentment in marriage. Don't think you're going to find contentment in divorce. Don't think you're going to find contentment in singleness. You find contentment in Christ. And then if you feel led to these to marriage or to singleness, fine. But we are content in Him. We are fulfilled in Him. That's our focus in life. It is Him. Look in Philippians 1. Not only is Paul content in Christ, but he says, Christ is my very life. That's what he's driving at in 1 Corinthians 7. Being married is wonderful and fine. Being single is fine and wonderful. In fact, like we've said, Paul says, in some sense it's better, he says. The main thing, though, is Christ is our life. That's what it is. Christ is our life. Verse 20 and 21. According to my earnest expectation and hope, that I will not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness Christ will even now, as always, be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. He says, whether I die, he's in prison right now, whether I die or whether I live, all that I want to know about is if Christ is exalted in my body. If I burn, I want to burn brightly for Christ. If I live, I want to live for Christ. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That's the man who wrote 1 Corinthians 7. The man's heart was consumed utterly with Jesus Christ and only Him, and he wants everyone else to be like that. He wants everyone to be like that. Look in verse 12 of Philippians 1. Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. Aren't you glad? The circumstances I'm in, they're advancing the gospel, Paul says. What's his circumstances? He's in jail. He's in prison. But Paul says, I'm in prison, but my circumstances are making the gospel go out because other people are hearing about my imprisonment. They're being made bold to preach Christ. I'm witnessing to the Roman guards here. It's wonderful. That's the man who wrote 1 Corinthians 7. It's a man whose whole life was Jesus Christ and Him crucified. This helps us as well. This general teaching about serving Christ where we're at, it helps us because there's different seasons in life, right? I went to the retirement home today. We have a ministry there. This church has a ministry there. And I didn't preach on it today, but I preach on it fairly often at retirement home and when I used to preach at nursing homes as well. I used to preach on the prophetess Anna in Luke. You remember Anna? And here's Anna. She was married and her husband died years and years and years ago. But Anna remained unmarried, went to the temple, fasted and prayed, served the Lord. And I tell people at retirement homes and nursing homes, hey, the world may have forgotten about you. You may never have a newspaper article or a news report written or spoken about you. Christian magazines may not recognize you. But God in heaven will know who you are if you have a ministry of prayer in this retirement home and nursing home. Missionaries will be sent to the field if you have a ministry of prayer here. Churches and pastors will be built up if you have a ministry of prayer right here in your room where a lot of people have forgotten about you. If you'll serve the Lord where you're at right now, God knows your name and you'll be rewarded for it one day. You see, no matter where we're at in our season of life, if we're with God, God will use us. You know, for some Christians, you just have this, not everyone has this trajectory, I know. But for many people, they become a Christian when they're a young, single teen, and they serve the Lord faithfully at their local church and at home with their parents. They get married and they serve their spouse. They have children, they serve their children, but their children get older and they move out and they get married. And now they serve their spouse and they serve in different ways now with the children out of the house. Maybe a spouse dies and they're in a different season in life, but even in that season, they can serve the Lord where they're at, and until the day they die, they're serving the Lord. That's what Paul's looking at here. It's that principle. No matter where we are at in life, if we're with Jesus, it's okay. He's going to take care of us. That's the principle here. It's before us. Amy Carmichael, famous missionary to India. 3 big stages in life, let's say. Amy Carmichael as a younger lady, she never married. Amy Carmichael as a younger lady in Ireland serving the Lord. All right. Stage 2 is Amy Carmichael in India, serving the Lord decade after decade as a missionary, rescuing children and spreading the gospel. That's good. Then there's a third stage in Amy Carmichael's life, and it's when she has this terrible injury, and she's inspecting a house, looking over a house or so, and someone had dug a hole in the wrong place, and it was kind of dark, and she stepped into this house, and she fell down, broke her leg, twisted her ankle, damaged her spine, and for the next 20 years, basically, she lived in a room. That was her life. Well, how can anyone serve her at that? How can anyone serve the Lord like that? I mean, she's been active, she's been going, a single lady, all over the world. Well, it's those 20 years that she wrote many of her books that still exist. And without those injuries, we wouldn't have those books. So you see, just through different stages of life, wherever God puts us, serve the Lord there. Serve Him right there. Wherever that's at in life, serve Him. And we have to ask ourselves that question, don't we? Where are we at in life? What season are we in right now? Where do we find ourselves in right now? Paul says, wherever you find yourself at, it may be a job, it may be between jobs, it may be retirement, it may be married, it may be unmarried, it may be 100 different things, but Paul says, wherever you find yourself at, serve the Lord. Make Christ be the greatest thing in your life. And serve Him. Serve Him. That's what Paul says to us. Was there any discussion there? He just puts us in different places. And wherever we find our feet, General Lee had a saying, I can't get it right, but he said something like this, be wherever your feet's at. That's what General Lee would say. Basically, what that meant was, hey, wherever you're at right now, be there. Your whole self, be there. Don't be over somewhere else thinking, just be here. At least that's the way I take it. Wherever you find yourself in life right now, serve the Lord. And that's something all of us can take from this. And I would say, when a time of change comes, when we're thinking about change, change is okay. God has different seasons. He has different callings. It may be to get married. It may be to stay single. It may be a new job. Whatever it is, just make sure that's God's will before you do it. Make sure that you have liberty to do that thing. Because God has us where He has us right now for a purpose. I know the book, but I have never read it before. Yes. Yes. That, The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment, would be like a classic book. And it's really well known. I've never read it though. Actually, I think was thinking of that book either today or at some point in the past, thinking about this message and things. Yeah. It's a Puritan paperback. You can find Banner of Truth probably. I think of, you remember from Sunday night about in Acts 13, one of the men in the Antioch church grew up with Herod the Tetrarch. So he was a man who knew one of the main men of the time. And maybe he had an opportunity to witness to him later in life. I don't know. So wherever we find ourselves at. And I mentioned Amy Carmichael earlier. She didn't go there to rescue children. That's not why she went. But when she got there, she saw the children being left to temples, essentially temple prostitution, all this. She saw all that. What's she going to do? She didn't go there to rescue children. But that's why she was there. And God used her to rescue children as well as to spread the gospel. So, we are in the Lord's hands. That doesn't mean we don't have responsibility. We most certainly have responsibility for what we do, but we are in the Lord's hands, and where we are placed in life, let us serve Him where we're at.